Hey guys, so in this lecture what we are going to do is we are going to learn forms in React, and of course any web application or any system isn't complete without getting forms done. So what we will see is we'll start with the basic input, then we'll try to have an input in a child component so that we can have components for different functions or form elements that we want to. And then the next thing is we'll try to see different elements, which is like a select box, a text area. So we'll go from there, and then we'll also have a complex form where we'll have multiple inputs taken from the same form in a React component, how you can handle the inputs depending on the type of the component that you're dealing with. So that's for the summary or what we are going to do. Now let's get started with the code. Again, I have cleaned up the code a little and made ready for forms in React. You can definitely start from the start folder, or you can do is you can use the same component that you had in the previous lecture with just some cleaning that you probably coded in that lecture. Again, you can go to the app.js, and that's where we start our coding. Okay. So the first thing let's see is a simple input element, and how we can do it, a simple input element. Let's go to the content. Let's try to create an input here. Let me just give in some enter so that you can see my face on the right. Okay, so input tag. Now input tag will definitely have a value. Let's say equals to my input, and you can also have a placeholder, but if you give a value, the placeholder makes no sense. So let's just give the value, and let's save it and see what happens on the screen. And the page is refreshing, and fantastic, my input is here. Now let's try to display the content of the input out here, but it's very difficult to display it in normal JavaScript or HTML. So what we will do is we'll create a constructor out here, and we will have a state given, which is my input value, and let's say this is my input. So whatever this value is, that will be the state. Now let's try to use that state out here and replace the content of the input field. So this dot state dot my input value. Let's save it. So now what happens is you are reading it from your state variable. Now how will this help when you try to update or change something in the form? I'll show you. So let's try to do an on change on this one. So on change equals to some method. So my input changed. Okay, let's say. Now how will you handle the my input changed? Well, simple. First thing is you need to bind it. So make sure you do that in the constructor. So you do this dot my input change is equal to this dot my input change dot bind, and this. So that way you have already bound. So now you did one on change, then you bind it, it'll give you an error. So let's try to create the function. Let's create the function and save it so the page refreshes correctly. Now all we are going to do in this function is whenever an input comes in, you just need to update the state. So let's say I'll just say this dot set state and change it to my input value. Let's update it to input changed. Okay, so whenever I make a change to my input, the input should update it to my input changed. So let me go here, let me just type in something, and it shows input changed. Very easy, right? But we don't want the input change to be something that we already have in place. So let's first thing do is let's try to display the content of the input as an h4 tag. So what we will do is we will do an h4 tag and try to display what our input says. So this state dot my input value. Now what will happen is rather than replacing the content of the input, we will just show it down there. So whatever is the input, and if I just type it here as a D, it will change to input changed, and this also updates, right? But we don't want that to happen. We don't want our custom input to be entered. We want whatever the user has entered to be updated out here. So whatever the user enters needs to be updated here. How can that be done? Very easily. So what you do is you go here and you pass in an event. So what happens is whenever you have an event, you can access things. So what this event has in store for us, let's see that. So let's do a console log of this event and see what we get in the event. Let's refresh the page, open the console. Okay, let's just type something so that event gets printed. So now you saw that the event got printed, and when the event gets printed, let me take it up a little so that you can see it on the screen. And it has a lot of things. It has target, handler, and so on and so forth. So what we need is first to see what the input target is. So let's try to print e.target, and that's how you can access the particular element that was updated or that was in question. Let's do that. And the target is input changed. You see that? That's the input field. Now you can also get the value for that versus. So let's try to get the value of this particular target. So the way we get the value is we just do a dot value. So let's try to see what the console shows. It should right now just show input change because we have it hard coded to that. It should be inputted D. So whatever you inputted, although after that the input changed. So what we can do is, rather than having input changed hard coded here, we can use this e.target value. So let's just store it in a variable, saying variable item value is equals to this. Let's remove the console. We don't need it any longer. Let's use the item value and put it in here. Let's save it, refresh the page. Let's close the console. Okay, now my input is something awesome. You see that? So whatever I type in the input, it gets updated. And the way I did it is, first I created a state variable for it, which is my input value. I stored the input's value in that particular field. I bound that input value to the value of the input field. So wherever you have the value, instead of the value, you give the state variable that you created. Now on change of this input, you handle a function, and the function, of course, it has to be bind to the class. And once you have the function running, you can just set the state to the new value by accessing the event.target.value. Easy, right? So that was a very simple example of having an input field onto the screen. Now what if this input field is in a child component? How do you handle? How can you make updates to the parent so that the contents get updated? Which means the h4 is in the parent, whereas the input field is in the child. So let's create quickly a child component for it. So let's say we have a component called my input component. Okay, all this component does is it has an input. So let's just copy this input and paste it down there. We don't need the class name, a normal div is good enough. And let's try to use the my input component out here. My input component, and everything should be the same. Although it may not get the state variable because this state variable doesn't exist any longer. So what we can do is we can pass this as a property. So input value is equals to this dot state dot my input value. Now I can use the input value field as a prop and see if the input value comes correctly. And again, it will not work because the input changed is not there. Let's remove this for a second. Okay, I have a typo out here. Let's try to fix it. So it's this dot props dot input value, and now we have the input displayed correctly. However, when I click anything or change anything, nothing will happen at this point. You see that? I'm typing something and nothing is happening at this point. The reason being the value is defined and nothing happens on its change. So what we can do is we can do an on change equals to something. Now what this something has to be, this has to come in from the parent. So you can use the same my input changed field, but you need to pass it to the child component. So how you can use this? You can pass the same function. Let's say in the my input field, I call the same function is equals to this dot my function. Now when I pass this function, on change of this, I can say this dot props dot my function name. And what it will do is on change of this, it will call my parent's input change function, which is here. And this will internally call the same function that we intended to. Let's try to see what happens when we try to enter something. You see that? And everything works. So this was another example or how you can move the fields onto separate components and then reuse it from one parent component. So let's say you have a master form, or let's say for example a contacts page where your first name, middle name, last name, so on and so forth. You can end up creating different components for those and ultimately join them together. So that was a very basic example on how inputs work. We haven't still used it in a form. The next we're going to see is how to use it in a form, but that I will show you in the next video. So I'll see you then.